Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And one of the many delightful benefits of being a part of the Certain Point of View family is it's much easier to start bringing guests onto the show, something Matt and I have wanted to do for a long time. And so for our very first guest, very first crossover, we are very excited to have Aiken here on the podcast with us today.
Hey, guys.
Of course, from another past podcast, which Jeff has been a guest on many a time, and I will be in the nearest future. Ooh, spoiler.
Yeah. It's almost like we record those episodes beforehand.
It's that nebulous time of podcast recording.
Yeah, well, we're all aware of how those tend to go. No, I'm so excited to be on, guys. I've been loving the show ever since Jeff first told me about it. I've been listening to every episode, and I'm so happy to be here recording an episode since Jeff and I back in the day used to talk about video games all the time, and now we get to do so for a show.
Oh, yeah. Like, a lot of this podcast stuff that both you and I have put together, like, pieces of it definitely stem back to when we used to work together and would just be doing, like, building maintenance work and shooting the shit about nerdy things.
Oh, yeah. Another Pass is entirely just what you and I used to talk about. And in fact, I attribute, I think, in every single episode where I talk about the origins to you.
Well, I'm flattered.
Well, and I think also I can attest to the fact that the only reason me and Jeff have a video game podcast is because we would spend hours not recording, talking about it. And we're like, we should record this because we won't stop talking. At least maybe that'll give us a time limit.
It'll give us something to, yeah.
Right. And it'll be productive.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to come on because, like, I do love talking about video games. Like, I grew up with a Super Nintendo. I had a Nintendo before that. I think the real system for me was Super Nintendo.
Right.
Had an N64. Stayed a Nintendo guy for a long time. The Wii U was kind of where my breaking point was on that one. I was like, I don't know about this thing. I don't know if I want to spend the money for games that are just ports with touchscreen implementation.
Yeah, it was
Xbox
a breaking point
360.
for a lot of people.
Yeah, so that's when I at that point simultaneously started doing Xbox as well and decided just to I'll just stick with this for the moment. But then I've come back to the fold with the Switch. So I'm a Nintendo guy. I'm happy to talk about Nintendo stuff, especially because I recently bought an SNES Mini, which has been great, and I love it. And it's like, oh wow, all these games hold up so well. And it got me thinking that we're about due for an announcement of an N64 Mini, and that got me wondering what games would go on it. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you guys about.
All right.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting idea because, the Nintendo Mini and the Classic, the NES Classic and the SNES Classic both came out not too far apart from each other. But when the NES Classic came out, I don't think anybody really thought, oh, well, they're going to just do all their systems. Like, I think we were all pretty much like, oh, this is a quaint idea. The system's really old. Now we have a newer version of it with a certain amount of games already preloaded. And so, when me and Case were talking offline about this a bit, like, I was like, oh, yeah, that does make sense. I guess they are kind of fitting into this pattern now of, and they're no different than anybody else. It's just a different format, but everybody's re-releasing, remastering. We did a whole episode on that. And so it's only natural for Nintendo to keep putting out these tiny systems with a ton of games on them.
Yeah, I mean, like, I will say I was on record at the time of the NES Mini coming out as being like, they're not going to jump straight to Super Nintendo Mini. That's crazy. They would do, like, more games or, like, a different roster because there's so many games. And then, sure enough, like, 1 year later, it was like, oh, okay, we're doing the Super Nintendo Mini. And I was proven terribly wrong.
Yeah, they definitely committed to that, like, here is a nice little NES capsule. Here you go. No updates, no additions, no whatever. By the sales numbers and everybody who remembers trying to get an NES Classic when it came out, it sold just fine on its own, so why not jump to the next generation? So, yeah, no, although I wonder whether or not they actually will do an N64 Classic, because in thinking about it, there are a few stumbling blocks that immediately occurred to me.
Oh yeah, there's several, and that's why I think it's a more interesting process. The SNES Mini made a lot of sense. It's like, okay, cool. The games hold up really well. Like, the SNES is like the high watermark of like that 2D like pixel artwork or like sprite-based artwork style of gameplay that like later systems started to move away from. N64 is not the high watermark of its type of gameplay. Like, it is the nascent, it is the birth point for a lot of those like styles of games.
Yeah, no, it's the average gamer, the average, yeah, you ask the average gamer, it's like, what was a great RPG console, or what was a great 2D sprite console? What was like the Super Nintendo may not necessarily be the winner in a lot of categories. It may not be gold in many respects, but it's silver across the board. And so it kind of worked out to be that. And also it was its big selling point, I think, or certainly to me, was getting access to Star Fox 2.
Well, yeah, that was really interesting for them to release something that was never actually released. Like, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for it, and it was planned to be released in 96, but it didn't actually get an official release till this console. Whereas the NES Classic, to my knowledge, doesn't have anything like that.
No, that
right.
It has games that were less common for a lot of players, like the original Mario Brothers, which was an arcade game that some people had, but not a lot of people because the system didn't come with it. And things like that, or Donkey Kong Jr., which was kind of a flop in the US, and things like that. I mean, but also some of the third-party-ish games I'm surprised are on the NES Classic, like Tecmo Bowl, which I grew up playing. It was one of the only video games that my dad played with me because he wasn't great at games, but we liked playing the football game together. And I'm surprised that made it to the NES Classic, but I'm grateful if I ever get one because I loved that game, Or like the decision to put Double Dragon 2, but not Double Dragon 1, which admittedly 2 is the better game, but still, like, the selection process seems somewhat arbitrary beyond certain games.
I think they did Double Dragon 2 rather than 1 because Double Dragon 2 allows for simultaneous 2-player. And they released the Classic with 2 controllers, and several of the games had multiplayer in mind when they did them, like Tecmo Bowl. They had to do a sports game that wasn't a first-party Nintendo necessarily, because they did a lot of that. They started it in Super Nintendo, and N64, they went deep into that. So they kind of had to have that.
Yeah, the NES Mini definitely had like a 2-player focus. The Super Nintendo Mini did not quite have as much of one. It has a ton of RPGs. It's like great value, but there's like a lot of games missing from the catalog that should be on there. I'm thinking like the beat 'em up genre as a whole, like Super Nintendo, or like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time. People are been like, how come that's not there? Or
that one I feel was a licensing.
That's a licensing thing. That's arguably the best of those. But there's the Final Fight games. There's Super Double Dragon. There's all kinds of beat 'em ups that are of that ilk that were all over the Super Nintendo. And it's weird to see a whole genre missing. It's weird that they have F-Zero, which is a 1-player racing game.
Yeah, I mean, but they don't stray completely away from multiplayer. And to that effect, I mean, the best of those games was easily Battletoads and Double Dragon. That was like my favorite of the Super Nintendo. But they do have a ton of stuff here that, doesn't surprise me, but makes sense, like Contra 3 and Donkey Kong Country. Contra 3 being the best of the Contra games as far as I'm concerned.
Best run and gun.
I think the interesting thing here is to focus on Mario a lot and Zelda. Like on the previous system, you had both Zelda games. You had all of the Mario Brothers Nintendo games. On this system, we have, Super Mario World 1 and 2 and Super Mario Kart and Super Mario RPG. Like they're still catering to their flagship property, or like Link to the Past is on here. Whereas like, we don't get all of the Final Fantasies. We only get one of them. We only get Mega Man X1, which I think is, like, just on the previous system, NES Classic, you only get Mega Man 2, which is arguably my favorite. But, like, it seems odd to only include one of the 6 Mega Men that were on Nintendo. Like, not at least 2 or 3. And Mega Man X only had the first 3 on them. So to exclude those also seems a little odd to me.
Yeah, it also seems weird to exclude, like, the later Donkey Kong Countries as well.
Right, considering the second one is, almost unanimously regarded as the best one, and they left that out.
It's also weird that they only had so many games. Like there's about half as many games on the SNES Mini as there is the NES Mini, and the difference in terms of like storage between the two games is not that big.
It's negligible, for sure.
Yeah, like it almost sounds like it makes sense until you stop and think about like that hardware has grown exponentially, not multiplicatively.
Yeah.
Well, it's 30 on the NES and only 21 on the Super Nintendo.
But it's interesting to see the games they chose. I definitely felt like there was a little bit of what I call a Super Smash Brothers lean, where a lot of the games that are there star those characters. That's not a hard and fast rule. And it's interesting, the RPGs they chose have multiplayer aspects to them. Both Secret of Mana and Final Fantasy III do allow for multiplayer.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, hey, let's talk about the N64 concept, because like we were talking about stumbling blocks, and I think we kind of drifted away from that, but there's a few. So like the actual whole like quality of the games, like both the images don't hold up as well to our eyes because they're just rough polygons.
Yes.
They also the actual controls don't hold up as well. Like the N64 controller was really interesting when it came out, but even in that generation, the DualShock came out, and the twin analog stick system, which became now the default for how you control on a controller games in a 3D space, came out, and the N64 never had an equivalent. So it's weird to like think about like trying to play some of these games now where they were struggling to get this idea right that, you know, very shortly after actually kind of got nailed down.
Yeah, no, that generation in general was everyone wanted to do 3D. Nobody exactly knew what they were doing. Nintendo had lightning strike real good when Super Mario 64 came out, but as history shows, it wasn't perfect. And there was a lot of those games. Like if you put together an N64 Classic, you will probably have Donkey Kong 64, which is a game that many people look back on very fondly. I have no nostalgia for it. I started playing it last year, and my sheer frustration with the 3D controls on that thing was high to be calm about it.
If we get into like actual like picks for the system, I have a list that I've made up, and I have a category for I hope they don't do this, and Donkey Kong 64 is on that.
Well, also the interesting thing about the N64 is where we get into the most of the licensing issues too, because think about some of the big, and also the first time Nintendo really dabbled in mature titles. They had mature titles before that, but they still kind of kept it, you know, the Blood Code and Mortal Kombat and all that. Like, they still kind of kept it pretty wrapped up. But we have Conker's Bad Fur Day and then both Banjo-Kazooies, which are A, rare titles, which who knows if they could get the rights to, and B, Conker's Bad Fur Day, which is still one of my favorite games, it holds up sort of, but I know that when they re-released it on the Xbox, they bleeped out all the curses, and like the song structures were changed for like the Great Mighty Pooh a little bit, and like there were major changes made to it, so I don't know if they'd be able to do the original again. And then you have games like GoldenEye, which is absolutely one of my favorite shooters still, but definitely doesn't hold up. When they re-released it on the Wii, they redid it with Daniel Craig. It was not a good game. You know, it was good at the time, and it revolutionized first-person shooters, and so did Perfect Dark, but both of those games do not hold up.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up Rare, because that was a thing that I wanted to talk about. Like, Rare was a second-party company during the N64 era. Like, Nintendo owned a majority share of it, and was instrumental not just in making good games for it, but also in making good first-party games. Like, you know, they were working on Nintendo IP, and that then a lot of that had to move away. And we've seen with re-releases for like Diddy Kong Racing, we've seen with just the Rare collections on Xbox. Like the licensing is not as like cut and dried. Like it used to feel like, oh well, these are all parts of Nintendo, and now it is very clear that it is no longer the case.
Yeah, and I think they were able to license or get permission or make that work with Rare titles on the SNES Classic, because it was Rare developed, but they were Nintendo properties. So I feel
it was Donkey Kong Country. Like it was very clear.
Yeah, they do the N64 Classic. They may not be able to do Banjo or Conker, but I feel like Donkey Kong would be a no-brainer, or they would pay or do whatever needs to happen to get DK64 or Diddy Kong Racing or something involving them.
Well, yeah, I assume that Nintendo owns the rights to those games. I'm guessing that Rare does not. I'm guessing anything with Donkey Kong in it, you know, all of those kinds of games in Diddy, because they own the rights to Diddy, which they didn't originally, but they did when they moved towards Smash Brothers and re-releasing Donkey Kong games. They covered that. And so, I don't think Rare actually owns the rights to those. But games like Perfect Dark, which was very much a Nintendo property at that time, now is not owned by Nintendo anymore, you know. And then there are other games like Case, you mentioned I hope they don't put it on the system list. There are a few games that, though I love the characters and I love the gameplay, they don't deserve to be on it. So Kirby's made an appearance on every one of these mini systems. And Kirby
hang on, before we go too deep on the games, let's talk about features for the console. Since I feel like the game stuff we can talk a while about, and but so let's so the licensing issue for games is part of the problem for the N64 collection, because so many of the iconic games come from a company that used to be very closely tied to Nintendo and are no longer there. In addition, we can look at the good parts of it, which is that the N64 was really known for multiplayer. So the idea of having multiplayer, that's cool. Also,
yes,
emulation has very easily covered Nintendo and Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. That's been really easy to do for a very long time. It is not quite as good at doing N64. There's a ton of emulators out there now, but it is very easy to have janky polygons, to have the renders be kind of off. It's not as easy as doing just a 2D sprite-based game.
Yeah, and what's interesting is while the Virtual Console for Wii U has released N64 games and has done, in my personal experience, has done a fairly good job of it. They have not released many of them. If I remember correctly, they've only released 15 titles, which is a lower number than I would personally estimate if they were to do an N64 Classic. If you were to ask me, Jeff, how many games did they put on it? I'd say 18.
Yeah, I was
maybe
thinking
16, but that's
probably
still
about around 20, somewhere in that range. 15 would be really small.
Yeah, it would. And
but let's also talk about the controls, though. Because, for example, the Nintendo and Super Nintendo controllers were fairly flat and easy to package. The N64 controllers are not. Also, Nintendo and Super Nintendo were two-player focused. There were very few four-player games for the Super Nintendo. A couple, but not many.
And it required an adapter.
Which they didn't package with this release. But the N64 was the first system to have 4 controller ports on the system, default, start.
Yeah.
And so they would have to package 4 controllers with this, right? Because,
yes, it would.
And it would also mean that they would want to make a focus towards 4-player games, because why would you sell a system full of 1-player games and include 4 controllers? Or why would you only include 1 controller? But then that leads the question of how small can they make the system?
Right.
Because you have to be able to plug all 4 controllers. Now, technology has come a long way, and so they could probably adjust the actual ports to be smaller and the plugs to be smaller. But the controllers themselves have to be the same size. Otherwise, it throws off all the controls. Because what made
the packaging would be weird.
Yeah, because what made the controls tight-ish for some of those first-person shooters like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark was the fact that you could hold the controller in the middle instead of on the right and still have great control for those games, at least. And so they can't make them smaller, or at least for me, my giant man hands will not be able to use them.
Yeah, well, the controllers have been the same size. So,
that's what I was gonna ask. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, the SNES controller feels the same. The only difference is that it ends at a Wii nunchuck style adapter instead of a
the little U-shaped thing.
So the SNES Mini, for example, it flips down to expose the actual ports for the controllers. They have a cosmetic port that looks like a tiny version of the SNES controller.
Right.
So that shouldn't be a problem in terms of space on the physical unit, because the SNES, the original Super Nintendo, was similar in size to the original N64. So scaling it down, you could fit 4 ports on there, especially because they're willing to have it here's what it looks like, so it looks like the original system, and then here's what flips down to actually have the functionality component.
Yeah.
But,
so, I mean, if they've already got that precedent, so I could see that working.
But, here's the thing that we should talk about. What can they do to actually make it better than just, here's the system? Because the N64 was very multiplayer focused. And while I love local multiplayer, I don't really love online multiplayer. It's going to be a selling point if they could put online multiplayer. That will be a big deal. Between that and availability, which it's harder to get an N64 game than it is a Super Nintendo game. But a Super Nintendo game is pretty perfect as it is, except maybe add a save state feature, which is what they did. N64, adding online multiplayer would be a big deal.
Yeah, it would be, but I don't know if that would help them sell it. because it's a little harder these days to have local multiplayer games on modern systems. And so having sort of like, if you and you focus more on the local multiplayer stuff and have the N64 Classic be sort of a party in a box, like you have friends over, you have people over, you do whatever, and it's just like, oh, well, we can play these games. And what a neat little thing to do. You don't have to argue about like getting a cartridge or don't have that. It's an all-in-one multiplayer experience.
Yeah, I mean that's true.
Well, and I think like at least based on my understanding of Nintendo's previous attempts at this, because again, I don't own them. They didn't make a ton of changes. I've watched reviews on them, and so I know there's a save state, and the interface is pretty intuitive. But for the most part, it's a Nintendo and a Super Nintendo. They didn't improve the games. They didn't change the games. They didn't up-res the games. They made them work well on HDTVs because they have to, because otherwise they would be horribly pixelated and unplayable. But besides that kind of rendering adjustment for modern TVs, the games are unchanged at their core. And so the reality is, if they make like now we get into the ethics of gaming a little bit as far as, staying true to your origins. If they improve these games or the controller, I mean, then is it really the N64 at that point? Like if you change that controller and add a second analog stick or improve the controls or even add a C stick like the GameCube controller had later, then it's not the N64 controller
It's
anymore.
true.
And same for the games. Like, horrible cameras aside, a lot of those 3D collectathon games were defined in that generation. And if you make the controls tighter or change them, or cosmetically make them look better, higher rendering, you're moving towards remastered territory, not re-release. And the previous systems were re-release. And while I think I'd like to see some of those improvements, I feel like if you're going to do that, then why not release a collection on the Switch that you play? Like, don't release the system, just put everything on a card so you can play it on a newer system with all of these improvements. Like, the point of releasing these classics is why I don't think they'll do that remastering. And it was why I'm also thinking, and I talked about this a moment ago, they may not go to the N64 next. Think about an entire thing that Nintendo's known for that they haven't touched in the classic genre yet. The Game Boy and Game Boy Advanced. The DS. Like, I think a Game Boy Classic that's the same size as the Game Boy, but has no, like, the cartridge slot is cosmetic, and it has, imagine how many Game Boy games you could probably fit on that thing.
Yeah.
A great deal, yeah.
And so, like, my thought is it might even go in that direction. Maybe they won't do the N64 because of all of these problems, and maybe they'll move towards handheld classic systems.
Now, the Game Boy Classic would be a very odd thing. Well, they would do it. They would shrink it down because, look, I love my old stuff. I really do, and I've committed to carrying those things around. But most people, like, smartphones that have gotten big enough or bigger are maybe around the size of a Game Boy Pocket. A Game Boy Classic, the DMG, that thing is huge.
Yeah.
If they keep the proportions and shrink it down to the size of a Game Boy Pocket, it would. I think that would be that's step one. And they can fit so many games on there. And do you think they would do just straight up Game Boy or go Game Boy Color?
I mean, I feel like they would put those together because the only difference were some games were optimized for color, but beyond that, it was you could play Game Boy games on the Game Boy Color and vice versa. You just lose some of the graphic fidelity.
And you could actually fiddle with the color selection before you start a game. I've always enjoyed that.
Yeah, the only reason that they might just do Game Boy is when they did the re-releases of a bunch of Game Boy games on the 3DS Virtual Console. They did them just in like black and white versions. It is the only thing I could imagine.
Yeah.
Which who's to say? Like they could potentially do a really interesting black and white portable console. I would prefer them to do Game Boy Color, but it is a question of how much they're putting out there and what they're trying to celebrate with the console.
Mm-hmm. Well,
yeah. I mean, and also with these classic consoles, like they're clearly they're selling well to the point where they're impossible to get. I mean, but that's also another history point with Nintendo about supply and demand. That's a whole other conversation. But like, I'm just curious, like, what's the end goal for all of these? Like, the end goal for the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo were nostalgia. Point blank, that's it. That was the point. They sold it on nostalgia. But like, now that we're getting to N64 and then the Wii, like, we're not going that much further back in time.
I like that you just skip the GameCube.
Yeah, well, so I love the GameCube, but like, and it was actually one of my favorite Nintendo systems. But even still with the GameCube, like, not even skipping that and going back to that as well, like, we're not going that far back in time anymore. Like, so do they even think the nostalgia is there? Whereas at least with the Game Boy, that's as old as the Nintendo, more or less. So there's still more of that nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is,
fuel,
the N64 is actually really old. Like, we are in our 30s. We think of it as being like a later system in the lineup, but like it came out in 1996. Like, it was
the GameCube's over 15 years old at this point.
Yeah, like the N64 is definitely retro at this point. And like I said, there is a selling point to the idea of like, oh, I miss these games, and unlike like I said, the Super Nintendo and the Genesis and the Nintendo, like, they have not been as widely available. So I could see them doing it.
True.
Like, I don't want to discount the idea and be proven wrong again, because I think it's a chance. And I think even if you're just doing a straight re-release, people would be interested. So why don't we talk about, like, if they were to do it, are there games that would make it worthwhile? Because that was another question I had. Like, the Super Nintendo had a wealth of games. I was really upset at how many games were missing. Like, now, that said, I understood you couldn't have all of these, but like, I love Mega Man games. Why is the next 2 and 3 on there? I loved all the Donkey Kong Country games. Why aren't those ones on there? But I understand that there's a limit to how much you can put on there. Like,
I think I might have just figured out why the number of games changed. Like, I was actually just thinking about this right now, and it really has to do with Virtual Console price point. If you look at 30 Virtual Console games, 30 NES games, it's got that $5 each. That is going to be $150. If you take 21 games at $8, that's going to be about $168. A little more than that. So they couldn't go too far past.
Well, and I have a theory also about the Mega Man games that just hit me as well. And it was something me and Case were talking about recently. Why? The re-release, the legacy collections. That's why they're restricted.
They don't need to go so deep.
Because they want people to buy the... Right. If they released all those games on these classics, then anyone who bought these classics wouldn't buy those legacy collections for both, which are coming out this summer.
Which I'm so gonna buy.
I'm buying 1 and 2 of the Mega Man. I might just stick to 1 for X, but that's a whole other conversation.
It's a conversation I'd love to have,
but yeah,
they've got my money.
Yes.
I don't care. I know it's a bad idea. I don't care. They have my money.
But you know what? Frankly, the Mega Man games aren't going to be the selling point of an N64 Mini. So
no, that's true because Mega Man Legends.
Mega Man Legends was on the N64.
Right, it was, but that's all we're going to say.
It was not
about
good.
It. All right, let's talk about the games.
Agreed.
Like, we've got obvious ones. We've got ones that should be on there but might not make it on there. We've got some weird conversation stuff regarding Rare, and then we've got more niche ones, and then ones that we don't really like. So, obvious ones. Anything with Mario in it.
So yeah, let's start with those. Mario Kart, Super Mario 64,
Paper Mario,
Smash Brothers, Paper Mario. All of those will definitely be
Mario Party.
Mario Party 2.
Probably the first one.
I think not the first one, Mario Party 2. Because in the first Mario Party, they had the mini games where you'd basically have to stick your palm on the analog stick and tear your skin off, spinning it as fast as you could.
And also break the analog stick.
So I don't think they want to break controllers. I don't think they want to mess with anything. I would say Mario Party 2.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, for the Mario Party ones, like, there's 4 on the system.
Definitely.
So
3.
I wouldn't be upset if it's just one of them, or they might even do 2 of them. Like, the multiplayer aspect, I think, will be a selling point for this, primarily as a local multiplayer, regardless if they do anything else. So Mario Party makes a lot of sense. Mario Kart makes a lot of sense there. So those 2 categories make a lot of sense just for the type of system they're selling.
They would certainly have Ocarina of Time and probably Majora's Mask.
Yeah.
Yes, if the Nintendo system is anything to be based on, the fact that Zelda 1 and 2 are both on there, and Zelda 2 was a divisive game like Majora's Mask, they'll likely put both of them on there.
That
I
was
would
my
agree.
thinking.
Well, and also it's a system that doesn't have a lot of RPGs, so having these longer experience games on there that are first party makes sense. Like Super Nintendo had no end to it,
Yeah.
so it was like, okay, cool, we'll put Zelda, sure. Now Zelda didn't have a sequel on Super Nintendo, but like, all right, so Secret of Mana is kind of like that, and then we've also got Final Fantasy, cool. You know, there's only so much.
For RPGs on N64, okay, they got Paper Mario, they could put Legend of Zelda in that thing. All right, now Quest 64 and Ogre Battle, Person of Lordly Caliber.
Ogre Battle would be good, but that's in my niche category.
Oh, that'd be so niche.
I feel like
I don't think
good game.
like,
so
okay,
niche.
So anything with Mario, anything with Zelda, I figure Super Smash Bros. Is also obvious.
Yes.
Like, that's a huge selling point on this one. Star Fox 64, I think, holds up better than a lot of games.
It holds up
in 64.
It holds up. I still play it.
Star Fox 64 is regarded as one of the best Star Fox games ever made, and they've remade it on other consoles so many times that that will definitely be on there.
And you've got 4-player combat modes, which is great. Like,
Star Fox 64 has been the Star Fox game that Nintendo has been trying to remake for years, for generations. Like that goes on there.
Now, Matt, you started talking about Kirby Crystal Shards before.
Yes.
And while it is not my favorite Kirby game...
No. So I have a long history with Kirby. I've always liked him since I played him on the first Game Boy. He's always been my favorite Nintendo character. He just is. He's always been. And so I played every iteration of every game except the 3DS Robobot, Planet Robobot. I haven't gotten to that.
I have
one
that.
yet. But
I can lend you that.
Oh, awesome. But so the Crystal Shards... I remember being so excited. I'm finally getting a 3D Kirby game. You know, I played all these other 3D Nintendo games. I'm so stoked that my favorite character is coming to N64. Now, the game's not awful. It's just okay. As far as Kirby games go, it's all right. But the problem is a lot of the stuff that they did in 2D didn't translate to 3D, and they focused on story, which Kirby is not known for his complex storylines. So that kind of held it back. That said, I wouldn't be upset if it was on there because, again, it's a Kirby game. I'm a fan of Kirby, but I think players who are not into Kirby or aren't familiar with that game might be turned off by it a little bit because they play it and go, what is this crap?
Well, it's also the only Kirby title on the N64, if I'm remembering correctly.
Correct. Yeah, it was the only one that came out. And then we didn't get another actual Kirby-style Kirby game until the Wii.
Yeah,
so there's
Air
that
Ride
too.
was GameCube.
Yeah.
Well, and also I'm thinking of also properties we previously mentioned. Yoshi's Story would probably be on there.
I was just going to bring that up. It's in the same category as Crystal Shards for me, where it's a sequel to a really good game. I think it's probably was more maligned at the time than it really deserved.
Yeah,
yes, I would agree.
I think that in retrospect, it's like, oh, I guess those weren't that bad a game. Like we were like so hungry for like fresh, like Mario was breaking the third dimension and like the graphics are so amazing and look at all the things that to have kind of like a more traditional 2D side scroller with just kind of fine 3D graphics.
Yeah, its greatest sin was not being Yoshi's Island.
Yeah. I mean that's what people wanted, and also I think I personally love a cute game. Anything with cuteness in it, I'm a sucker for. And that game was incredibly adorable, and so I think that's why I latched onto it. But yeah, it was by far not the best game ever.
Yeah, but I feel like it would have a place.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. So in terms of games that really should be on it, but people will frankly be upset if they're not. GoldenEye, we've talked about already. Yep. Like, people would go insane if it wasn't on there. Yeah. Like, if they don't have that game, they shouldn't bother, frankly.
Right. It's that and or Perfect Dark. But GoldenEye is definite. Perfect Dark is
that'd be
possible
nice if that's there, but GoldenEye is definitely definite.
Like, I feel like GoldenEye is more complicated to get because you have to get the Bond license, and then it was Rare developed, right?
Correct.
Yes, it was.
So
I'm not sure if it was Nintendo published, though, because there's an interesting thing where there's some games that, even though they're developed by one company, they're published by another, and Rare kind of did a little of both.
Yeah. But so, GoldenEye is the bigger name game, so I feel like, while we would know that if they put Perfect Dark on there, it's like, oh, well, that's fine. It's perfect. They've got Perfect Dark. The majority of people would be like, but they don't have GoldenEye. What are you doing?
But why no GoldenEye?
Right. Even though it's, they function the same. The controls are identical. But yeah, no,
Right.
I get that. I mean, I feel like the Bond license wouldn't be that hard, but they might push to make it not be Pierce Brosnan, just because there's rights and rules that go with all that. But I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've touched a little bit on the rare stuff, and might as well go further into it. Like Perfect Dark, I really don't. I can't see them doing both GoldenEye and Perfect Dark.
Right.
Like that would be a lot to do. I would as a player prefer Perfect Dark because I think it's a better game.
Yeah.
But I understand why GoldenEye has the cash.
Yeah, has the following
value
it
to it.
does.
But there are some other good rare games. Like I think Diddy Kong Racing is better than Mario Kart.
A lot of people do actually. It's that is it is a niche but strong opinion, and it really is a great game.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would agree with that per se, but I would say it's definitely on par, if not better. And I would agree that would have to be on there. I mean, history shows us with the other two systems, they like including the Donkey Kong games. So we would assume Diddy Kong Racing, and provided, we're assuming they have the rare license, Donkey Kong 64. But my question is next is branching off to the rare titles I mentioned earlier, Conquer and both Banjo-Kazooies. Those...
Oh, and then one other one, which was considered a killer app for the system before it was released, and then kind of faltered when it came out. Killer Instinct Gold.
That's right, and Killer Instinct Gold, which I did have. I forgot that was rare. So yeah.
Do you remember when the first Killer Instinct came out, and we were like, "Oh my God, that's what the Nintendo 64 is going to look like"?
Yeah.
Or what was it? What was it called before
The
The
Ultra.
Dolphin.
The Ultra.
Oh no, the Ultra.
Ultra 64. That was it.
Yeah.
Ultra 64. Yeah.
But so those 4 games are not Nintendo licenses. They are rare games that were on a Nintendo system. And as we've seen, since then, they've been released on Xbox systems. Xbox owns the rights to those. The newest Killer Instinct came out on the Xbox One. So those are, I think, firmly in our category of should be, but probably won't, just because of rights and all of that.
Now, in recent years, Microsoft and Nintendo have shown the ability to do, I mean, as far as like cross-platform online, Sony's the roadblock in that, not Microsoft and Nintendo. This
True.
is something that they might be able to work out. I don't know. Who knows how strongly Nintendo wants to do this? But if they do it, that is a maybe. I agree. It's a not definite, but you know what? Stranger things have happened.
Right.
Yeah. And like part of the thing is the N64 has strong representation in certain categories and weak ones in others. Like we were just talking about RPGs. Fighting games is another one. Like Killer Instinct is one of the few. Like Smash Brothers is a different type of fighting game.
Right.
Yeah.
But after Killer Instinct, you've got what? Mortal Kombat Trilogy?
Mortal Kombat 4.
Mortal Kombat 4. Yeah. And then there's Clay Fighter 63 and a third,
Yep.
and it had a sequel as well. Like there's just not as many great options. Like I would prefer Killer Instinct over the Mortal Kombat games, although probably Trilogy would be the next choice in that list.
I think so too. Especially since
and
Mortal
then I
Kombat
can't
hadn't
think of
been
any-
included on the other systems.
And they don't really
I
have a
feel
lot of, they don't have Midway involved there. But given that they have Konami involved, this might mean Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, which is a lovely reminder of 3D.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I wanted to move to next. Is we have a bunch of standards for Nintendo that are on their previous systems that either have no representation or have terrible representation. So like, there's no Metroid on that system, so we don't get one. Their Castlevania 64 essentially was garbage, but it's the only Castlevania, and they've had Castlevanias on every other classic, so I guess we can assume they may put it anyway.
Yeah, which is why I would say, because there's Castlevania 64 and Castlevania Legacy of Darkness.
Right.
Now, Legacy of Darkness was that, like, sort of, but not quite a sequel, more of a re-release. So I would imagine they'd go for that one.
Right. But then thinking of other third-party titles, that's where we get into weird territory, because like I had a lot of games for my N64 and a lot of games that I liked, but that weren't necessarily quality games. And they had minimal third-party support that wasn't companies that were already teaming with them on other stuff. So we hit a murky kind of a gray area of, well, what else do we put on the system? Because like movie tie-in games, who cares? Most of them are terrible, and I don't even remember how many were on that.
Well, there's a genre that we're ignoring,
Which is
sports.
Oh yes,
And that's where a great source of multiplayer goes. And what's interesting is in my own putting together of a list, I threw 1080 snowboarding on there because that is a Nintendo title.
I've got that on here too.
And
That's true.
And then you start to wonder, well, how many Mario sports games do you throw on there? Because you got Mario Tennis and Mario Golf.
Oh, that's true. I
For
didn't even
N64.
think about those.
Both
those
are
are good
excellent
examples.
games.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking, like, I did not think there would be that many like really solid games. I thought I would actually have a hard time making a decent list. But when I started thinking about some of the early days of certain franchises, it occurred to me there's Tony Hawk 2.
Yeah.
Which is a really good one. There's also some really good WWF games that would go on there. And
God, yeah. I played so much Warzone on the N64.
Well, yeah, their first wrestling game of those style, though, was a WCW NWO game.
Oh,
that had
Nitro,
3D
right?
wrestling. Nitro. And then after Nitro, we got, there was one before Warzone. WrestleMania 2000.
That's
which
right.
Was the first of the WWE games, and then Warzone was after it, which was a more watered down version of WrestleMania 2000.
True.
Which were all great multiplayer games. But we're also forgetting the dungeon crawler genre. I mean, Gauntlet made its big return in the N64 generation with Gauntlet Legends, which was an arcade game. Yeah, and it was 4-player.
That's true.
For other ones that I think would be good options on there, Bomberman 64.
Yeah. And that's one where it's not quite a Nintendo title, but I mean Hudson's so pretty free with that. So
yeah, it's also a really good multiplayer. So I feel like that's a good selling point on that one. Then there's some weird options on there. So like, let's see. I mentioned some good sports ones. Wayne Gretzky Ice Hockey was one of my personal favorites, and like just sports games in general. I know that Midway had an updated version of NBA Jam that was like Slam Masters or something. I forget the exact name. But then there's just other first-party games that were pretty good. There was Pilot Wings, which they didn't do the Super Nintendo one, and I understand that. I feel like 64 probably holds up a little better, but like they're more tech demos than actual games.
Yeah, and it was a launch title.
Yeah. Blast Core would be interesting.
I was thinking about that one too.
You know what we haven't talked about is the so the controllers would obviously have Rumble just built in, right? Like
oh goodness, yes.
We wouldn't have
even
to
if they have little
card,
Rumble packs already plugged in, like no matter what, Rumble's got to be built in.
Here's one that would require a little bit of implementation issues, which is Pokemon Stadium.
Right, I was going to say Pokemon Snap was a huge hit at the time, so it'd be odd for that not to be included. Also, we're forgetting there was a ton of Star Wars games on this system, and now
Shadows of the Empire.
There was a ton more third-party stuff, and there was an F-Zero game for N64 also.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so there were a lot of racing games. That's a good point to bring up. Like there was F-Zero, there was Wave Race was a launch title. 1080 Snowboarding is of itself a racing game of a different style. I was watching one thing that when in preparation for this that said there was like 65 racing games, and that's a ton. Like
that's a lot of racing.
I think the multiplayer angle is a good thing to focus on. So we have to like question like, all right, which are the ones that are worthwhile? One launch game that I really hope they don't do is Cruisin' USA.
Right. I was thinking about that. I was like, no, they wouldn't. They wouldn't.
If they have to do a realistic racing game, and I'm using air quotes on that one, I would prefer they do San Francisco Rush. Which was a lot of fun. I mean, it was an arcade game first, but I felt like the N64 adaptation was pretty good, and but it had that it had a realistic car look to it as opposed to kart racers.
But
so,
people love kart racers on the N64.
I mean, there were a lot of them, and that's what I mean. Also, there was Carmageddon 64. Yeah. Let's not forget that. I think that, also, and like, I want to bring up the Star Wars games, but in retrospect, like the other two systems had Star Wars games and they weren't included. So my guess is they're just not going to get the rights to this one either. But like Rogue Squadron and Shadows of the Empire were huge.
Yeah, but those were also bigger games than the earlier generation Star Wars games. Like Super Star Wars was
and they also had Episode 1 racers.
That's true.
Also that too. Yeah, so they could just do N64 just racing games.
They really could. Also just sports games because there were so many. But like also we're forgetting a third-party game that was a huge disappointment, and I'm hoping that'll include. But Earthworm Jim 3D.
Oh, I've stripped that from my memory.
N64 as well, which was.
I can't imagine them touching that. Yeah,
we've all erased that from our memory. But like. Talking about additional peripherals, like Hey You Pikachu was also a big Pokemon game on this system. Like, this was the first home console to have Pokemon games, because before that, they were only portable games. So, like, you have to imagine they would include all of those Pokemon games, or at least Pokemon Snap and Stadium, which would require...
Pokemon Snap has a really good following, too, so I feel like that would... Now, in Pokemon Stadium, there is a rent option within it, so you don't have to plug in your game. But it'd be nice.
Oh, actually, on the list of "Oh God, please don't," there's always Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero.
Oh God, please don't.
My God, right? No.
Or Paperboy 64, which was also terrible.
Yeah, and then of course there's the infamous Superman 64.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if they didn't do Paperboy for the NES Classic, I can't imagine them going, well, we can't leave Paperboy 64 off of this.
Right.
The fans will clamor for it.
Yeah, like then there's a couple other good games. Like Treasure had Mischief Makers, which I really enjoyed.
Oh yeah, Mischief Makers was fantastic.
Mischief Makers was good. There were. I actually really liked Tetris 64. I thought it was a cool way of doing Tetris. Like there are a lot of games now that I'm looking through the list of games that I liked that probably wouldn't be on it, but like would be cool to see.
It'd be cool to see Sin and Punishment on there.
Yeah, that's true.
Speaking of Treasure, yeah.
Oh, or think about like South Park. Their first big game was on the N64, and it was a multiplayer game. It was a multiplayer shooter, essentially.
The first-person shooter, yeah, with the cow launcher and I remember that thing.
And so, like, it's possible that we would get something like that too, which, I mean, wouldn't be terrible for nostalgia purposes, but, like, beyond that, also there was a Rampage game on it, Rampage World Tour. Like, there are a lot of games that I remember playing and liking that are a little more obscure, but I think would be cool to have a revival of versus those other games that had horrible controls that might not, or at least NFL Blitz. Like that was the generation that NFL Blitz debuted, that the Dreamcast and the PlayStation. And so, that would be a great arcade multiplayer game to play also.
What I think is really funny is the NES Classic and the SNES Classic were definite. Hey guys, remember these? They were awesome. And it's sort of like people don't need to be convinced, oh, hey, those were awesome. But to release an N64 Classic and then have a whole bunch of games on there, it's almost like guys, remember, there actually was some good stuff on here.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
That's true.
That's true of just about any Nintendo system that's come out. The GameCube's got a lot of like exclusives and strange stuff that were like, people forget it when they just go with the sort of popular opinion.
Yeah.
Or what, and like the N64 was the start of that. But yeah, like what we're talking about here, whether exclusives or franchises that started or entries they had, like, yeah, there was some really good stuff on the N64. So why not?
I think a cool way to wrap up this conversation would be, because speculating is all well and good, but we should give the audience some facts about us. I like to, when we talk about game styles or game consoles, to pick our favorites. And I know it might be hard for you guys, or it might not, but I think we should all say what our favorite N64 game is, and it can be one of the obvious titles, or it can be one of the more obscure titles. But like, if you had to pick one game that had to be on this console, this re-release, what would it be?
Well, I'm going between two right now. Star Fox 64 and Paper Mario. I'm probably going to lean towards Paper Mario, but I have so many hours of my life live in Star Fox 64. But probably Paper Mario.
Cause here's the thing. If the question of what game is my favorite on N64 versus what is the one that needs to be on here the most, I think are two different answers. Because
that's why I'm just asking for your favorite.
My favorite is Majora's Mask.
Okay.
Good man.
Yeah. That's a good choice. For me, it would probably be. Oh, it's tough. It's tough between Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's Bad Fur Day.
And
I
those are
loved
other
both of
good
those
ones.
games.
Like, god damn it, I love Banjo-Kazooie. It's one of my favorite games of all time.
Yeah. So like it's tough for me. I think the game though that I would have to have on this system that's also one of my favorite games on the N64 is actually Mario Kart 64. It's still to this day one of my favorite Mario Kart games of all time, one of my favorite racing games and multiplayer games of all time. I think currently Mario Kart 8 Deluxe comes the closest to how I felt playing that game. But if I had to pick a favorite game that I sunk the most hours into when I had my N64, it was probably Mario Kart 64.
Well, and here's why I would go with Diddy Kong Racing over that. And that would actually be my answer for like one that has to be on here. Even though I understand the rare issue might make it tough, and that like there have been a couple attempts at porting Diddy Kong Racing to different things. And
Yeah, it's DS and
there was like a Banjo-Kazooie version. There was Diddy Kong, but with like a bunch of like the rare stuff stripped out. But like the original Diddy Kong Racing had like such a great single player mode in addition to a great racing that's where I have a hard time imagining like any like Mario Kart is a great multiplayer game. The racing game is fine. Like as a single player, but like there's only so much fun you can get out of a single player racing game traditionally. Like Diddy Kong Racing had such a cool open world, like almost an RPG element to it.
There was some good story to it, good development
with like secret stuff and unlockable characters, and like it was such a richer like game experience. Like now the individual racing. Yeah, sure. You might prefer the Mario Kart, you might prefer the track style. You might prefer any of that. I was always a banjo riding a hoverboard, banjo riding a hoverboat, kind of guy. So like that was all good, well and good. And I know some people loved like the flying stuff, but like sure, like the weapon systems were not as like crazy and out there. It was like, okay, you got missiles instead of like shells, and like nothing's quite as extreme. But
and Mario Kart 64 is a little more beginner friendly. Like Diddy Kong, you really kind of had to learn the ropes.
Yeah.
Well, right, which is why for me, I mean, we know Mario Kart's going to be in there regardless. It would be ideal to have both. But also, Donkey Kong or Diddy Kong Racing was the debut of Conker as well. Besides a Game Boy game, that's the first game he appeared in before.
It's not besides
64.
the Game Boy game. The Game Boy game came after it.
Yeah.
Oh, did it really?
Conker's Pocket Tales. They were like, well, we've already made this, so here it is.
Ditto
right,
for Banjo. Banjo's first appearance was on in Diddy Kong Racing.
Yeah.
So we'll see if this comes true. Thankfully, we're recording this less than a week before release, so we won't get scooped like when we waited 3 months to release our Switch episode.
Yeah.
Although that was my quota for mentioning the Switch in this episode, so there you go.
Shit, I don't have my Big O card up right now.
Case, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much,
This was
man.
wonderful to spitball and relive our past with the N64. We're clearly all Nintendo heads, which is fun. Why don't you, before we sign off, tell people a little bit about your podcast and where they can find it and what you do.
Okay, sure. So I host another past podcast on the Certain Point of View Network, which is a movie review show where we talk about movies from the standpoint of what at the time could have made them better. Like it could have been a bad movie or it could have been a good movie, but like something that could have made it a substantially better one. And so like Jeff has been on a lot. You are coming up on an episode at some point. And it's just nice to take a movie and be like, okay, so this movie had these things that happened in production. What could have been done at the time? So you can't be like, well, Animal House would have been better if it focused on Kevin Bacon because he went on to be a star. Like, no one knew that. It was his first movie. So I like doing those sort of like thought experiments and really kind of going into like deep dives and like weird concepts that could have been like, how cool would it have been if this actor who had been in the running nailed the part and like launched a franchise instead of such and such actor. So that's the main show I host. I also host the Scruffy Nerf Herders on Certain Point of View, which is a Star Wars Dungeons and Dragons adventure featuring Ben and Addie from the Certain Point of View news show, as well as a host of other players. And I am the dungeon master for this whole adventure, set between Star Wars: A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back.
It's a good time.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show. We had a blast. Of course, listeners, as always, give us a review, give us stars, subscribe. Same for everything on the Certain Point of View network. Also, let us know what your favorite N64 games are. I know several people listening to the show have strong opinions about this.
And we'd like to
them
know
personally.
them. Yeah.
So please comment on the Twitter, Facebook, wherever you feel comfortable. mentioning stuff. And please let us know what your favorite N64 games are, because like there are games we didn't even talk about, like Turok, which I loved as well. We didn't even bring up. So let us know what your favorites were. It's always a blast hearing from you. Again, it was a pleasure having Case on the show. We'll hopefully have more guests in the near future.
Yeah, it's something
so
we'd like to do more of.
Yeah, this has been great.
Yes.
I'm so happy to be on here, and I'm so happy to be the first guest.
Yes,
what an honor.
It's an honor that you can't. You'll always be the first guest. No one can take that from you.
Damn right.
As long as you don't like hold this episode and then like squeeze one in right beforehand.
Nah, man, it's too quick of a turnaround. We'll just put this one together.
We're gonna do a spike guest with Kieran.
Yes,
Exactly.
spike that one in there. No, we'd like to have him on at some point soon. But thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Let's keep this conversation going. Once again, I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.